So of course, I'm Genevieve Ritchie. I've had the opportunity to speak here before and to get to know some of you over the last few months. Today, I have the wonderful pleasure of introducing our guests. Our guests include Immanuel Ness, Leandros Fischer, and Philip Marfleet. I also have the pleasure of introducing a book project that I have been working on with Sharzad and Sarah Carpenter, Sharzad Mojab and Sarah Carpenter. The book is titled Marxism and Migration. And it's an anthology that I've been working on with my co-editors. We've also had some wonderful help from Stefan Dobson, who is here today as well. And I want to introduce the book a little bit to us today, or introduce how the project came to be in some ways. And to do this, I'm going to invite us to think a little bit about what it means to do class struggle analysis. What is made visible in our thinking when it is framed by the dynamic and antagonistic frictions between classes. And so as I was preparing myself for today, I quite often ask this question of myself, right? And I quite often do it while I'm flipping through various media sources. So I'm kind of scrolling through what's happening in the world, trying to make sense of it, trying to make sense of this incredible world that we've built for ourselves and continue to reproduce. And last Wednesday, as I was looking at online media sources, one story in particular caught my eye. It caught my attention because it is a struggle that is taking place on the land that I'm on, and it's also over the land that I am on. And so I'm situated on Six Nations territory. And as some of you may have already experienced or may know of, there is this intense moment of struggle that's happening on Six Nations territory. And it's with land defenders, some of them, or they're also known as Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And so it's between the land defenders and the Ontario Provincial Police. And here the police force is acting on behalf of the province, but also acting on behalf of real estate developers. And so last Wednesday, a Haudenosaunee woman was arrested at the protest site, and the police took her into custody while she had been there with her children. And it sparked protest, and it sparked moments of solidarity. And there was a protest out the front of the Hamilton police station. The protesters who were there, many of them are already active in movements to abolish the police. And many of them were streaming photos and images of themselves holding messages of solidarity. The protesters were women of color. They were in wheelchairs. They were coming from unhoused communities, communities of drug users, and they were also students. Right? So these are the majority of people. These are the people that we talk about. And then I thought about the dish with one spoon, wampum. And the dish with one spoon is an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabeg, and it's to share and care for the resources of the land around the Great Lakes region. The dish with one spoon covers the lands now occupied by Toronto and Hamilton and their surrounding areas. Right? And it's an agreement to practice a way of life that is rooted in relations of care and mutual interdependence. So when we acknowledge the lands of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabeg, the Senecas, the Mississaugas, the Huron-Wendat, and the Chippewa, when we acknowledge the dish with one spoon, we are acknowledging a mode of producing and socially reproducing life. We're acknowledging a way of life. From the government standpoint, the land defenders are preventing a redevelopment project that is building housing, it's building infrastructure, and it has the potential to increase shopping complexes. And so it is a rebuilding of a mode of life, a very disruptive mode of life. It's a mode of life that sits in opposition to the dish with one spoon, and it's a mode of life that will displace communities and people. Right? So this is an intense moment of struggle over land and life. Thinking about that, I then contrasted it with some of the conversations that I've had with newcomers and refugees. And I was thinking about how many of them identified housing as a key barrier to their resettlement. about how their homes and ways of lives were violently destroyed by wars, particularly in the MENA region, that is North Africa and the Middle East, and about how their displacement generates markets in housing, in transport, in employment, and in legal services. And so it is kind of these seemingly disconnected moments, right? Similar to the ones that I've been describing now, that we have been thinking about when we're trying to ground this project, right? When we're trying to think about the relationship of Marxism and migration. And we're trying to build a foundation for how to analyze both Marxism and migration that comes from an understanding of struggle. To rephrase this point, we've also been thinking about how and why capital moves, right? How the contradictory movements of people and capital generate particular legal infrastructures, particular practices of resettlement, conditions of militarization and war, ideologies of difference and domination, and concrete expressions of consciousness. And so in trying to grapple with all of that, this social totality that we're trying to make sense of, I keep returning to Marx's Grundrisse, and I've been reading it primarily as a methodological text. I've been reading it as a way to push beyond the reductionisms that plague many linear, liberal, and narrative approaches to studying migration. Many non-dialectical approaches to migration are often limited by the problems of methodological nationalism and methodological individualism, which some of our authors here today have spoken about. Such approaches may cast people on the move as undifferentiated subjects, unmoored in a world of nation states. Migrants then become the subjects of liberal human rights or politics of rescue and resettlement. Migrants become numbers to be managed or remittances to be recalculated or calculated. And all the while, the forces of capitalist imperialism fade away into the background with legacies of Orientalism and colonialism. Capitalist imperialism then appears as an absent force and reappears as benevolence in its liberal bourgeois democratic form. As an aside, I just started reading a history book titled Empires Without Imperialism. And part of what this book lays out is some of the ideological moves that attempt to de-link liberalism from the violence of imperialism, to recast liberal imperialism as a growing democracy, right? As an experiment in liberty, individual market freedoms. And overall, it is a project that de-links political formations from its economic ones. And so this is part of the work that Marxism and migration seeks to do. Right? It seeks to reunite, to make visible the inner connections of seemingly separate moments, right? Reuniting moments of enclosure and displacement with moments of land redevelopment and social resettlement. Policies of national development in the global South with global infrastructures of production and distribution. And moments of protest or resistance grounded by their political and economic bases. And so I have been using this word reunite, but actually what I'm trying to think about is the inner connections between social relations that we don't immediately see. And in the Grundrisse, Marx pushes political economists to consider how the ideals of the population is itself an imagined concrete, right? That is a category that describes people yet erases the class composition of society. As Marxist feminists, we would also say a society delinked from its radical and gendered class composition. The imagined concrete shows up in discussions of displaced populations. It shows up in mobile masses emptied of class contradictions and conscious articulations of race, sexuality, gender, and age. The political economy of managing a mobile, uprooted, unmoored population builds from the imagined concrete of the national body to generate knowledge and categories for containing, settling, and quietening the disorder of migrations. Yet where migrant populations are theorized as abstractions, analyses fail to see the conditions of monopoly, dispossession and enclosure, that underpin the agentic choices of migrants as they attempt to remake livable lives. The policies of managing migration, managing migrant people can then appear as questions of nationality, of citizenship or borders, rather than global contradictions of capturing and circulating value. So if there's a concrete that can be delivered to us in some kind of abstraction as an imagined concrete, how then are we going to think about a concrete, right? And to paraphrase Marx, the concrete is the concentration of many determinants. The concrete is the unity of the diverse. And so with regard to migration, myself and my co-editors, we've been thinking about how to understand that, that the making and enclosure of land is a determinant of migration. In other words, migrants come into being with relations of private property, and yet the ideologies of the nation obscure the constant mobility of people. The larger point here is that migration is internal to the workings of capitalism. And to quote Adam Hanier, who joined us last month and who has a chapter in the book, migration is a movement of people that is relentlessly generated by the movement of capital, and which in turn is constitutive of the concrete forms of capitalism itself. So understanding migration as internal to global capitalism brings key contradictions into view, which our book will take up across various chapters. Specifically, the book is going to think about contradictions with regard to the state, border practices, and sites of accumulation, about the cheapening of labor power as workers move across regions of accumulation, how migration is a process of social reproduction, and about how resistance is theorized and practiced. And so at this point, I think that it's best that I turn it over to our guests and let them elaborate on the chapters and the work that they are doing. So to introduce them, I will give you a quick bio, and then they will each present and we can have questions at the end. So our first speaker will be Philip Marfleet. Philip is a Professor Emeritus of Migration Studies at the University of East London. He has published widely on globalization, migrations, refugee histories, and social and political developments in the Middle East. These titles include Displacement of Memory and Refugees in a Global Era. Secondly, we'll have Immanuel Ness, who is based at the City University of New York, and he writes about global migration, labor migrations. We read part of his book for today, which is Southern Insurgencies, and he is the co-editor of works including the Oxford Handbook of Migration Crises and the Encyclopedia of Global Human Migration. And then lastly, joining us from Germany is Leandros Fischer, and his work considers social movements, political parties, and digital practices in Germany, as well as research with Middle Eastern refugees in Cyprus. And I believe that he has just completed a postdoc at Aalborg University. So these are our three guests, and I welcome them. Thank you kindly for giving up your time, and I will turn it over to you. And as I said, I will give you a 5-minute warning just before. So Philip, please join us.
Thanks. Am I being heard? Good. Okay, well, hello everyone. Thanks to Genevieve and colleagues for inviting me to participate. I hope I don't gabble too much in order to keep to time. In my contribution to the forthcoming book, I've written about Marxism, migration, and the state. But right now, I want to focus on issues of social class and forced migration. Essentially, why matters of class are of profound importance in thinking about mass movements of refugees today. A key aspect of the dominant discourse of the refugee is the idea, very strongly advanced by many establishment politicians and the mass media, that migrants arriving in states of the global north are people seeking economic advantage who approach migration authorities dishonestly in the guise of people seeking sanctuary. For the popular press in particular, these migrants are attempting to exploit credulous so-called host societies. as many of them arrive through irregular networks, without money or possessions, they're under suspicion, said to have malign intentions and to be a threat to the good health of national society. Their circumstances are a matter of disinterest, and their claims should be resisted. It's these attitudes that underpin exclusion, militarized border control, and continuous tragedies like the mass deaths taking place in the Mediterranean among those crossing from the Middle East and North Africa. There's a long history in the global north of highly charged attitudes towards international migration, not least the idea that there's a legitimate model migrant, in effect a normative migrant, whose journeys complement the idea of travel to lands of opportunity in which economic advance and social mobility await diligent, hardworking, and conformist new citizens. This goes back to the earliest theorists of demography, notably Ernst Georg Ravenstein, who in the 1880s proposed his so-called laws of migration, suggesting that the attraction of jobs and higher wages drove international movements of population, the so-called pull factor. This had an enduring influence, especially for researchers in the early 20th century in the US, who focused on immigration and assimilation. And here, immigrants were said to have journeyed to specific destinations motivated above all by rational self-interest. They were also depicted as traveling through successive phases of adaptation to the new society, achieving economic and social progress and eventually blending into American culture. What was called a theory of straight line assimilation that endorsed dominant images of a land of opportunity peopled by conformist immigrants. On this view, long-distance migrants are motivated by self-interest backed by resources to support their journeys. Today, there's a widespread view that those seeking to move to Europe, North America, and Australasia, the three most desired target regions for many migrants from the global south, necessarily possess money and social capital they mobilize purposively to obtain access to destination states. There's reluctance to accept that many, probably most such migrants lack such resources, and extreme reluctance to address their circumstances and experiences. I want to suggest a different picture. The evidence is overwhelming now, I think, that as mass migrations from zones of crisis in the global south progress, they engage primarily poor and vulnerable people who lack material resources and significant cultural capital. Not only are these migrations patterned by social class, but class is a key factor exposing those involved to the dangers of multiple, high-risk, long-distance journeys. Mass dispossession has become a feature of the contemporary world with record numbers of people on the move. They come in the great majority from what I call zones of crisis, regions of the global south in which the cumulative impact of dominant policies for development has stimulated economic, social, and political breakdown. The key issue has been the impact of neoliberalism, relentlessly undermining states already fragile because of the impacts of colonialism and post-colonial arrangements. Since the 1970s and the ascendancy of the neoliberal model, more and more states and regional systems have entered crisis, notably through what in the 1990s Mary Kaldor called the New Wars, with their civil conflicts and ethnic cleansing. So the Horn of Africa, Central America, Central Asia, and the Middle East have produced millions of forced migrants. And increasingly, these have come from among those most disadvantaged in their places of origin. A pattern has emerged, one that has historical precedents, but which is today more and more pronounced. As crisis looms, those with wealth and influence exercise a choice to leave. Some have liquid resources, cash, or the ability to mobilize cash or credit. They have documentation, passports and permissions. They may have significant social capital, including links to local and international networks. Above all, they have mobility, and so move first and furthest from threats that confront them. A good example, I think, is that of Iraq, where mass forced migration was not a direct outcome of the invasion of 2003, but of what followed. The savage imposition of market policies and of a political system based on ethnic privilege. The first to leave were from Iraq's business elite that was not part of the new arrangements, who used their connections to fly direct to cities of the Arab world, Damascus, Amman, Beirut, Cairo. As pressures increased, the middle class followed them, often after long preparations and complex journeys. There remained the mass of displaced people. Many have undertaken tortuous journeys by land and sea, entering irregular networks in which danger is ever present. My own research in Egypt shows how Iraqi refugees with material and social capital settled initially in Cairo's prosperous suburbs. Later, they were followed by those who'd mortgaged their possessions, and finally by those who'd been financed by families and communities that entered lifelong debt in order to send their young people to a place of safety. Of course, this is not an absolute, but the pattern of migration correlates closely with social class and even the geography of refugee communities in Egypt. Something very similar has later been evident in the case of refugees from Syria. What about those still in Iraq? Because a vast proportion of the Iraqi population has been affected by mass displacement. Ethnic cleansing has been so widespread that to this day, millions of internally displaced people, so-called IDPs, live in impoverished slum areas outside major cities, something that was completely unknown until the years following the 2003 invasion. These areas have become the reservoirs from which come those, notably increasingly women and their children, who undertake the longest and most dangerous journeys through irregular networks, ending up in places like Northern Europe at the so-called jungle camps in Calais and Dunkirk on the coast of France, or on places like Christmas Island off Australia. Dispossession and mass migration greatly emphasize relations of class. Those with the least choice become those most compelled to undertake the most perilous journeys, to arrive in potential places of safety with little more than their clothes and shoes. And those who are most likely to be apprehended, imprisoned, and deported. For many years, refugees from the global south were seen as an undifferentiated mass. This can be explained in part, I think, by the approach I described earlier, an assumption that authentic migrants are people who mobilize resources to progress their economic advance, and that those who appear poor and desperate must be illegitimate and under suspicion, and that their circumstances don't merit closer examination. The more carefully we look at contemporary migrations, the clearer it becomes that historic forced migrations have also been differentiated emphatically by class.
Philip, I'm going to give you a 5-minute warning.
Thank you. In a rare but particularly insightful assessment of refugee movements from Vietnam in the 1970s, two authors recorded their own observations of refugees moving to American bases military bases in Southeast Asia. Those refugees who stepped off the early air flights, they noted, were, I quote them, well-dressed people, carrying the traditional luggage and the usual accoutrements of travel, including tennis rackets and an occasional bag of golf clubs. Later, when the boat people, so-called, who escaped by sea, washed up on beaches in the region, those without money, passports and influence would be compelled to embark on leaky vessels like those that sink so often in the Mediterranean today, they were said to be, I quote, more miserable than anyone had imagined. When Palestinians were evicted from their homes during the events that gave birth to Israel in 1948, the wealthier urban elite moved at an early stage to cities of the Arab East, often taking their portable resources and arranging for financial transfers through the banking system. They were followed by the educated middle class, among whom many eventually moved to the Gulf, becoming the cadre of the emerging oil states. Those who moved last, under the greatest compulsion with the fewest options, were the urban poor and the mass of the peasantry, who found themselves in the refugee camps of neighboring states. To this day, the people of Gaza and the camps of the West Bank, Lebanon and Jordan are most likely to be the descendants of these communities, these earlier communities. Mass displacement emphasized, exaggerated the disadvantages imposed by social class. And after years of silence in South Asia about the realities of partition and mass displacement in India in the late 1940s, it's becoming clear, largely due to the work of feminist historians, that class also marked that great refugee tragedy. So finally, I've omitted one key aspect of the discussion about class and forced migration in this very brief presentation: the extreme reluctance among scholars of migration to mobilize concepts of the Marxist tradition. Focused upon states and their agendas, as Genevieve earlier mentioned, and influenced by persistent ideas about normative migrants and their ambitions, researchers have until very recently seldom examined the circumstances and experiences of the massive displaced people. Initiatives like yours here in Toronto bring a fresh and very welcome approach. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Philip, and thank you for the kind words. Immanuel, I will turn it over to you. You're muted.
Thank you, Genevieve, and also Sharzad and Wesal, I'm sorry, for your invitation to have me speak at this workshop. The focus of my work is contemporary in nature, but also is rooted in historical and material conditions that are changing dramatically and that are rooted in a Marxist analysis that addresses many of the concerns that Genevieve raised earlier. We really do need to have a sense of the nature of who is migrating and so forth. The fact that a growing number of women and people from the global south are becoming the majority of migrants. I think for a strong Marxist understanding, it's necessary to start with labor and work, and therefore I'm going to focus on something that I've been doing for the last well, I'll say 2.5 years, well, actually 12 years, actually, the temporary labor in the global economy. And so in that way, I think it reveals something about the comments that were raised by Philip just now, the role of the state and so forth, and also the fact that increasingly we're seeing a working class that's emerging amongst migrant labor. I think that we need to distinguish amongst migrants. There is an absolute difference between people who are immigrants and migrants, and while both may be exploited, everyone is exploited in some respect. Temporary labor is, in fact, the historic norm. This has been put forward by the work of Serac and others, that the guest worker, the temporary laborer, is the original form of labor migration. And it seems to me, based on my own research, but also a empirical analysis of the global economy, that temporary labor is the primary force. And I think from a Marxist perspective, we should look at the 250 million temporary labor migrants who are employed in the world, and see them as employees or workers that certainly represent a cohort that's going to expand dramatically in the coming decades of the 21st century. If you look at the data, which I will not present to you at the moment, it's very clear that this is the emergent trend. I guess I'm prefacing my talk by saying that I believe that this sector of migrant labor is highly exploited, and perhaps amongst the most highly exploited populations in the world. So I'll contend that temporary labor migration and foreign remittances contribute to prosperity, the idea that they do, which many people have argued within the liberal and mainstream press, but within academics, that's the basic argument, that prosperity is achieved as a consequence of remittances, and prosperity not just for the migrant themselves, but also prosperity for people back home. I believe that this is a myth that's propagated to advocate a way to increase the number of guest workers who are employed in rich countries. But in reality, labor migration has a highly deleterious consequence for most workers, and does not contribute at all really to economic development in developing countries, by and large located in the global south, or exclusively in the global south. While migration is viewed in the literature as mutually beneficial for migrant workers in poor countries and rich countries, with labor shortages, and with rich countries that have labor shortages in crucial economic sectors, I argue that in reality, migrant workers are highly exploited and do not benefit from working in rich countries overseas. In fact, I see this as a dynamic in which we're seeing countries becoming economic processing areas for the sending of migrants to other countries that are relatively or absolutely more prosperous. While workers do not benefit, neither do states and populations that send migrants overseas. Conversely, supporters of this, I think, false claim that has been dominant throughout the literature in sociology, the social sciences, as well as history, um, and we can name them, contend that remittances flows to poor countries provide indispensable revenue to allow those countries to grow and develop. I see absolutely no evidence of this happening, or very limited evidence that is barely recognizable in such countries such as, for instance, Nepal or Myanmar and so forth. The highly exploitative system of labor migration exposes a fundamental facet of the global neoliberal system of neocolonialism, the extraction of profits from highly exploited and vulnerable countries. This is a major point, I think, that we really need to see migration as an extension of extraction that has been taking place over the last at least 250 or more years. It still remains important to weave in a discussion of the commonalities and differences of this system of global labor exploitation around the world among what I would see as three channels of migration. One would be the Americas or North America. The second would be Europe. And the third, which is growing dramatically, would be Southeast Asia. We must draw upon them and bring them together in a world imperialist system to provide critical insights about the bigger picture, which I recognize would represent a more profound intervention in understanding migration as a field than a more descriptive approach to each major region. Most work in the field does not examine the major force of migration in a holistic manner. Poverty and inequality in sending countries and demand for labor in receiving countries and regions. Examining the major global corridors of migration, or channels, if you will, rather than the specific regions. Through doing so, there is a need to fill a crucial gap in migration studies through unifying conceptual Marxist research on global economic migration. And so we need to differentiate what is going on with respect to Southeast Asia, Europe and Asia, or Europe and the Middle East, et cetera, and North Africa, as well as the North American corridor. So if we look at policy advocates in the process, policy advocates in the poorest countries of the global South view labor migration as a necessary policy initiative to drive poverty reduction and domestic development goals. In spite of forecasts of policymakers that the age of labor migration will come to an end as investment is concentrated in poor countries, major countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America are continuing to experience the mass departure of young workers, ordinarily considered essential to national economic development, to work at low wages as temporary workers overseas. I can provide empirical evidence from Southeast Asia as well as Northeast Asia. This dominant model of temporary migration is accelerating throughout the world, and I would say particularly in Asia, as well as Europe, as a consequence of the international system of wage inequality. So in this way, I think that we need to incorporate a system of analysis that is Marxist, and in this sense, Marxism for me would be also necessitates an understanding of imperialism. That we're seeing this migration of temporary workers as a primarily European project. Initially, but not, it's taking place on a global scale, as I was pointing out, Southeast Asia, I'm sorry. By creating a flexible supply of labor through temporary labor migration to urban regions and foreign countries, capital expands. Meanwhile, migrant workers remain employed under insecure and precarious conditions in order to send remittances back to their origin countries. Institutionally, the World Trade Organization negotiations to establish a general agreement on trade and services envisages a global system of temporary labor migration as an important stage in expanding global production and consumer markets. We must weigh the significance of remittances to poor countries in Asia, as well as elsewhere around the world. Do transnational remittances, amongst the important questions that I'll raise, what I'd like to hear more about it and also raise is, do transnational remittances create economic growth within countries of the global South? Do peasants or rural workers and urban workers experience improved standards of living as a consequence of labor migration? What is the role of export-oriented labor training programs on economic development in South countries, particularly Asia? We need to understand these points, and we need an expansion of empirical studies to research this model that seems to be expanding throughout the world. My working hypothesis would be, again, to restate that temporary labor migration and remittances are two sides of the same coin, the former heightened by uneven development, and the latter representing migrants' response to economic insecurity and poverty. We must examine how temporary industrial migrant laborers contribute to economic security for the majority of residents in the destination nation states. One specific focus that I would suggest is to examine the emergence of state labor export policies as a fulcrum of economic dependence in a global system. Does labor or export policies reduce or reproduce economic insecurity for a majority of the residents? I leave this as an open question, but my point would be is that it does. A second aspect that we need to examine is the effect of industrial migration schemes in destination regions in North America, Western Europe, East and Southeast Asia. What are the forces that contribute to the growth of manufacturing migration, and how do they impact on labor relations within those states themselves? How are these workers integrated into global supply chains? You said 5 minutes?
Yeah, I'm going to give you 3 minutes. Sorry, I left you going a little bit longer, but sorry about that.
Okay. How do established trade unions within the destination states respond to the insertion of low-wage workers, many of whom are women? Building on this kind of analysis, some of this work I've set forward in my previous work on internal migration in places like China, India, and South Africa. It's imperative to examine those processes as well, but I see now a greater trend toward cross-national migration. So, for instance, in a state like India or China, migration has been a very important force in especially in China, in development. Yet at the same time, it has also created a high level of dislocation and poverty in rural areas. And that also requires, the literature would say, and it requires a significant form of examination. So we need to understand the expansion and proliferation of temporary labor in the coming years, the decades to come, in the capitalist world system. And we need to look at its effects on the reconstitution and dynamics of the global class structure. We need to explain the significance of what I would say the international division of labor and how global migration has an influence over that, national and regional supply of employment and unemployment, in a Marxist perspective, the reserve army of labor, and the importance and magnitude of migrant labor in the global system. A crucial need is also to examine the decisive strategic significance of temporary labor migration in manufacturing as a key contemporary shift, and I say contemporary within the last 10, 20 years, which is deeply rooted in the political economy of global capitalism, global supply chains, etc., and a shift which confers material advantages to advanced regions in the global north. I'd like to add to that the point that we shouldn't only exclusively look at manufacturing, but also services as they expand through technological advances. So that's another aspect. So this new research in the future will require empirical and analytical examinations of temporary labor migration from poor and middle income countries, which I consider poor too, to advanced industrial countries in all major regions in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. It needs to examine the comparative historical development of temporary manufacturing, and I'll add services, the labor that goes into it through introducing training programs that have taken place at the turn of the century. And as I pointed out earlier, many of these training programs occur in destination states in North America, such as the US and Canada, Southeast Asia, Myanmar, Thailand, Malaysia and Thailand, and Europe within the European Union. The rising demand for temporary laborers has motivated states to fill demand for low-wage industrial and non-industrial workers through extending the programs from schooling and training to temporary fixed-term migration of low-wage labor. Temporary migrant workers are essential to staff jobs at key production and service hubs and are a primary means of supporting economic growth for developing countries in the global south as well. In addition, since the 1980s, temporary transnational labor migration as a new source of growth has been common to the service sector, domestic labor, household help, construction, and temporary industrial labor migration as a whole. So my hypothesis would be that the primary reason for this growth of temporary manufacturing and service labor is the significant differential in wages between the South and the North. In addition, we need to understand and examine, research how temporary migration is used as a development strategy by developing and emerging states, to use the language of the World Trade Organization, et cetera, and how labor and foreign direct investment contributes to a growth in migration regimes in the global south. So for instance, the development of various zones where migrations are trained in major cities of poor countries in the south. So we also, since we're looking at a temporary system, we're not looking at immigration whatsoever. The process is one that is circular, and therefore, what is the effect of remittances, which I think has been studied extensively, but needs to have greater and deeper analysis. But what is the effect of remittances to families of workers in origin countries? Ostensibly, workers send remittances to families at home to reduce economic insecurity and to increase economic development in their states, uh, though often this is at the cost of breaking physical contact with families and by enduring long hours in severe working conditions, brutal working conditions in destination regions, and long periods of time spent away from their family. I believe there's a need for research on temporary migration, which employs a Marxist theoretical perspective on what is the various forms of labor migration rooted in, like I said, Marxist political economy through examining capital investments like foreign direct investment, et cetera, the development of government migration programs. So we see a greater level of unity between government and capital, capitalist governments and finance as well as producers, and the recruitment programs in low-wage countries of the global south.
Emmanuel, I'm going to give you last thoughts.
Okay, my last thought would be is we have, I believe that Marxist, this project that is Marxism and migration is of absolute importance in understanding the new forms of class struggles that will be emerging in the years to come. And it's not one that is taking place in a very limited manner, but is expanding dramatically as a consequence of temporary labor migration. And I think that we should look at the temporary nature of labor migration as a new regime of capital, as part of the new regime of capital under neoliberalism today. And there's a tremendous amount of research that's necessary from scholars everywhere to document these programs.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Leandros, over to you.
Can you hear me? Can you please remind me how much time I have?
So you have 15 minutes. I will give you a 5-minute and then a last thoughts.
Well, first of all, many thanks to you, Genevieve and Shahrazad, for this great opportunity to participate in what I think is a very timely and much needed project. I apologize on behalf of Martin, who could not make it here today, but he already had a presentation, and on a edited volume, we are, well, I'm also participating on the subject of coercive geographies and forced labor. I'm going to say something about the context of my involvement with this project and what actually spurred me into participating with this contribution, which focuses on let's say, constructive critique of the so-called autonomy of migration approach. So much of the impetus for me in getting involved with this was my capacity as part of the left in the two countries where I feel home, namely in Germany and in Cyprus, specifically as regards to the debates that have been raging in Europe since 2015 regarding the question of migration, which, you know, as you'll probably know, it was one of the most contentious issues in the whole Brexit debate of the British left and beyond. Specifically, there was a simultaneity of crisis, because just as we have the crisis of the European project manifested mostly with, you know, the bailouts, so-called bailouts in Greece, and, you know, the asymmetries of the European crisis regime. At the same point, we also have a significant crisis of the European border regime, which reached its peak in 2015 when, you know, its three main pillars, namely the free movement within the Schengen space, Frontex, the sealing of external EU borders, and also the externalization of borders to beyond Europe were actually subverted by what was truly the autonomous movement of thousands and thousands of migrants, mostly from refugees from Syria and Iraq. So within this twin crisis, there is also a certain crisis of left-wing approaches to migration. In Europe, this is manifested, I think, we can speak schematically of two approaches. On the one hand, we have a sort of a left that celebrates migration, celebrates no border activism, but tends to be vague on questions of political power or of the nature of the state, and also its connections to imperialism. And also, in my opinion, very often succumbs to the temptation to use very liberal arguments for migration. For example, claiming that migrants actually do the work that nobody wants to do. And I think after this pandemic, where this idea that there are certain professions that are less valuable has actually been contested and exposed. On the other hand, however, and especially here in Germany, we have this idea that the only way to sort of create this kind of left populism is by actually speaking to the fears of the native working class as regards to migration. And case in point is the case of Oskar Lafontaine and Sarah Wagenknecht, which have actually very good ideas in many issue areas, but on the subject of migration, they take a very economistic perspective, saying that it's actually open borders. There's no such. It's a neoliberal plot to drive down wages, and of course we should take in refugees, but we should also understand the fears. And conversely, the image of right-wing populism is that, like most right-wing populist voters are actually confused, and we should sort of win them back. And there is a clear underestimation of the of racism as kind of like the ideological core that drives the new far right in Europe and beyond. On the other hand, but what happened in Germany, especially at the peak in 2015, but also afterwards, is that you had a massive amount of civic solidarity with refugees. So there are a lot of figures, but one of the figures that is very interesting, it's been estimated that around 20 to 25% of the German population have at some point or another participated in assisting the refugees that arrived in 2015. So beyond that, there was also a lot of grassroots activism. Not all participants rejected the idea of borders, but the impetus was that people have a right to move where they want to move, and they have the right to safety. And in recent years, this has been evidenced in the various campaigns in German cities to declare cities as safe harbors, mostly for people stuck in Greece or rescued in the Mediterranean or stuck in Libya under dire circumstances. So this development in Germany, at least, has not been sudden. It's actually based on a process that goes back at least 20 years, and in which the so-called autonomy of migration approach has been constitutive, or rather, the experience of pro-refugee mobilization in Germany has actually led the material background for the development of the so-called autonomy of migration approach. So, as the name probably denotes, the autonomy of migration approach stems from the autonomous Marxist tradition, which was pioneered mostly in the 60s in Italy by Mario Tronti and later on by Antonio Negri. So it was actually developed by activists who disagreed with the idea that the role of Fortress Europe is actually to keep people out. They said borders are not there to keep people out. They are there to regulate and filter actually who comes in and produce what other theorists like Sandro Mezzadra and Brett Nielsen have dubbed differential inclusion, namely the creation of hierarchies and different legal statuses within the working class that allows the exploitation of cheap labor. Now, I think that, you know, as somebody who believes that, you know, the Marxist idea that the emancipation of the working class is the work of the working class itself, I think this is actually a very interesting idea because it brings back the variable of labor into migration studies. Now, if you go to any conference on critical migration studies, the chances are that it will be dominated by a lot of presentations that deal a lot on the techniques of surveillance and bordering practices and all that, which are very Foucauldian in a way. The idea is that, you know, we have this constant perfection of bordering technology that actually, you know, makes migration more or less impossible. And I think that the autonomy of migration approach is a necessary corrective to this this idea that basically just makes labor and the needs of capital irrelevant to the whole migration process. It's being just reduced to the abstract will of states to power and to regulate and to survey and all that. Which doesn't mean that a lot of the theories from the autonomy of migration approach do not also kind of fall back to some very, you know, I would say post-structuralist positions, especially when it comes to the production of value. As probably you might be aware, the core of Italian autonomous Marxism was more or less that, in contrast to the classical Marxist tradition, which views the development of capitalism as the result of the competition between different capitals, autonomists mostly regarded the development of capitalism as contingent on the resistance of the working class. So there was actually a great focus on things like wild strikes in the 60s, and countries like Italy and Germany were actually the scenes where you had a very militant strike movement, mostly composed by immigrant workers. In the case of Italy, people from the south. In the case of Germany, Turkish workers that, you know, engaged in wild strikes, but were actually fought by the not just by the employers, but also by the traditional organizations of the working class. In the case of Italy, the Communist Party. In the case of Germany, the Social Democrats and the trade union bureaucracy. So this was actually...
I'm going to give you 5 minutes.
5 minutes, yeah. It's actually okay, because I thought that I wouldn't have much things to say. But anyway, well, so much actually, you know, in trying to describe where this autonomy of migration approach comes from. I think that its greatest significance for Marxist theory, in my opinion, is that it actually brings back the agency of migrant workers beyond the so-called push and pull factors, in the sense that a lot of the bordering practices we see today being enacted, biometrics, etc., are actually being enacted in response to the agency of people crossing borders and not necessarily going where, you know, where the material prosperity is, but where they are actually, you know, forming networks of solidarity with locals and etc. So anyway, this is, I will leave it there when it, you know, trying to sort of transpose the socio-political context of the debates. I nevertheless think that the autonomy of migration approach has a lot of deficiencies, which are immediately connected to its provenance from autonomous Marxism, and the idea of the world order that autonomous migration scholars adopt is that of Antonio Negri's empire, where more or less imperialism is out of the question. There is this decentralized thing called the empire, and migration as such is an insurgency. And what I find very ironic is that a lot of AOM proponents actually have recently, and it's in all honesty, this was actually also part of the project of where me and Martin were working on, have actually started emphasizing, the importance of digitalities and digital practices in enhancing migrant agency and proving that migrants are, have enough agency to cross borders and, and all that. By using their smartphones, which I find, it's very ironic because smartphones are actually the pinnacle of mass industrial capitalist production nowadays. They're mostly made in China under circumstances which most autonomous Marxists would deem as, Fordist or part of a different era. So there's definitely, to put it mildly, some space for readjustment there. Another point that I think would, deems a bit of, necessitates some kind of rethought is the idea that, all migration is subversive. Antonio Negri had this piece in the New Left Review 10 years after Empire, where he said that, migration is this constant insurgency happening against capitalism nowadays. And he was probably thinking of organized endeavors like the Central American Caravan 2 years ago, which was attempting to cross to the United States and all that. But, well, definitely not all migration is subversive. For example, it was a declared goal of German governments during the Greek crisis. They actually said it that, we want the brightest minds of Southern Europe to come to Germany. And there's actually a large-scale migration of Greek doctors and physicians coming to fill up shortages in German hospitals because the German state will not pay for the education of doctors at home. So in that sense, there is a kind of need to connect migration to the general socioeconomic asymmetries that also have to do with things like imperialism as interstate competition. And as I said, I think that there's definitely some room for improvement there. Finally, I would say that, and this is mostly Martin's part actually of our contribution, is that it's, we have to kind of bring Gramsci back into the picture when we speak of solidarity with migrants, and not just focus on the correct, in my opinion, no border activism and trying to free migrants from detention and detention facilities and all that. But we actually have to think how actually the so-called native working classes can engage in meaningful civil society alliances that challenge power directly, and not only in this kind of abstract global way, which is imminent in works like Empire by Negri. So I would just, leave it here. I kind of went a lot of back and forth in my notes here. So yeah, looking forward to the debate.
And thank you to everyone. It's wonderful to have kind of three different vantage points to enter into what are essentially, quite large and complicated questions that, as each of you have moved across issues of labor, the state, and resistance, and how we actually even just conceptualize the role of the state in terms of borders and categories of citizenship, migration, temporary migrant labor, etc. And